بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد خير المرسلين والآخرين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم افتح علينا فتوح العارفين ووفقنا توفيق الصالحين وانفعنا بالقرآن والذكر الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وعملا متقبلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم لا سهل إلا جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا. اللهم أعذنا من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا. اللهم اصلح لنا شأننا كله لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, inshallah, it feels good to be back home. And of course, really, home is where the people are, so it's really, I feel really homely and really honored to have so many loved ones to come out to see me today. And of course, first and foremost, I have to apologize to my teachers for speaking in your presence. Sadan and Sheikh Anwar, the Khalid Bankiship here, even he showed up, and alhamdulillah, I guess over the years, I've become more and more comfortable speaking in the presence of my teachers, but it took a long time for that to occur. But even so now, it's a bit unnerving, because we know that that when your teachers are listening to you, they're following every single detail, every single point, So, but inshallah, just bear with me naturally. So today, this particular lecture is entitled "The Economic Protocols of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam." A protocol is fundamentally a sort of standard set of rules, principles. I guess you're saying in a very short, the most abbreviated definition of something, a protocol. And economics itself is a relatively new science in the sense that for most of human history it wasn't, taken as like an independent or an independent area of study among the social sciences as we see them today. But even like terms like the social sciences, humanities, and all these sort of areas, they are relatively recent when we consider how long humanity has been on the earth. But often when people hear the word economics, we have a certain understanding, and of course, we understand it to be the study of what sometimes we refer to as macro or microeconomics, or the economic status or state of being of things and people on the level of government, and then also in people's everyday lives. Now, economics, in the Arabic language, the word for economics is al-iqtisad. And al-iqtisad fundamentally means moderation. And so the Quran says of the Ummah of Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ وَيَكُونَ الرَّسُولُ عَلَيْكُمْ شَهِيدًا. And thus we made you a justly balanced nation or moderate nation in order for you to be witnesses over humanity and for the messenger to be a witness over you. So al-iqtisad, or rather economics even, it originates from what is called moral philosophy. Because, for example, Aristotle, if I remember correctly, he calls it the household management, sort of managing the things, the goods in your home. And typically when people define economics, they include something about the idea of scarcity. How do you manage scarcity in your lives? Now, this particular lecture is not only about it's not a technical lecture about economics, but I do think it's important for us to sort of contextualize things in that particular fashion first and foremost. But being from moral philosophy, what that means is that that a person who is muqtasid, a person who is economical, a person who is of balance, is an individual who manages their wealth well, right? They manage their income and expenditures well. But it began with the idea of practicing moderation with respect to what we call virtue and vice. For example, courage is a virtue, and courage is important to ensure that one doesn't go to one or another extreme. For example, one extreme that one can fall into what in the Arabic language we call tahawwur, which is fundamentally recklessness. So when if you come across a person who has or says they fear nothing, that's actually a problem. Right? You don't want to be around people who say, I don't fear anything, right? Because that individual is reckless and they'll do anything in your presence and they'll get you in trouble. So that's an extreme, but then also the other extreme is the extreme of cowardice. Because at times we need to show courage, we need to have the courage to defend the things that we own, to defend our loved ones, defend our people. So courage itself is a moderating, we call a virtue, right, among the cardinal virtues that any human being who possesses is characterized as an individual of a certain type of balance, right? So it's bain al-ifrat wa tafrit, is to be between excess and between sort of negligence or falling short, and one does. Right? So when it comes to the issue of managing wealth, in a similar fashion, do you overspend or do you withhold too much? Right? That no, we want to be that you're not supposed to be one who actually you're a spendthrift, which is a problem, but also is a problem to be a miser. Right. So iqtisad or economy in our expenditures, in the management of our wealth, it is the balance is between those two extremes fundamentally. Now, of course, the topic of economics as opposed to economy is the management of wealth. And what's interesting about the Quran is that the word wealth, al-mal, is also referred to euphemistically, if we can say, or rather figuratively, it's often referred to as khair, is good, right? That, for instance, in Surah Adiyat, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it mentioned, وَإِنَّهُ لِحُبِّ الْخَيْرِ لَشَدِيدٌ. So the human being is ardent in his love for good, right? In that particular ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about wealth, about property. And so property or wealth is not inherently evil, right? If anything, property is necessary because without it, the human being cannot persist, right? And so in the area of economics or in the financial realm, people who have assets, those assets are often referred to as goods, right? So in the same way that the Quran says of wealth that it is good, that is something first and foremost that we need to reflect upon. That is not something inherently evil. But another thing about wealth and its management is that one of the ways that the pre-modern people, they judged people's intelligence was on the basis of how well they manage their wealth. Right? Because there's often this debate about, okay, what is intelligence? What are the signs of intelligence? Right? And so you can talk about the definition and say, well, intelligence is this, some type of, abstract type of knowledge or expertise in a certain type of abstraction, for example, right? Or is intelligence something that's demonstrated, right? The pre-moderns, they included the good management of wealth as a sign of intelligence. And this is why in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he refers to spendthrifts as sufaha, right? As fools, right? Because that was a sign of your lack of intelligence when you spend and spend and spend and spend until it starts to harm you, right? So that is also an important area of reflection when we talk about this before we even move on to what we call the protocols of the Prophet, economic protocols of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So in the Quran, al-iqtisad, al-qasd is utilized in multiple ways. It can mean what we call economy or a moderation, or it's often what's referred to in the moral realm as the golden mean, or sometimes iqtisad or a person's muqtasid is just someone who's mediocre, right? That you're just like an average person, right? So it's utilized in all these particular fashions. There's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he said, ma'ala man iqtasad. the one who is economical never becomes poor. Right? The person who's economical or the individual gifted with economy does not become impoverished. Right? So the Prophet ﷺ, he taught this fundamentally first and foremost. And so today I actually wanted to go through a list of what I call sort of 11 protocols, economic protocols of the Prophet ﷺ. Of course, the list is not meant to be exhaustive because I tried to induce them from my understanding of and knowledge of Islamic scripture, right? But Muslim scholars have been writing about economics since the, early or mid 20th century. And it seems that that was largely a reaction to European colonialism and the attempts to try to show that Muslims had things similar to what non-Muslims have. We see Muslims write about democracy. Oh, we already had democracy. We wrote about economics. Oh, we have an economic system. And so one of the founding fathers of Islamic economics is Abdullah bin Hamid Ali, rahimahullah. And there are multiple others who have written about Islamic economics as well. But many of the writers on Islamic economics, if you read their writings, you get the impression that Islamic economics is some type of some iteration of socialism, right? Now, there's one author from Pakistan, Dr. Ali Salman, who wrote a book a few years ago called Islamic Economics, Markets, Morality, and Justice. And he asked me to write the introduction to his book. It's a very small book. And so he came with a new take, right, when it comes to this question, and tried to expose that many of the early writers on Islamic economics were technically promoting just a certain type of sort of socialism, or one thing they might say is that, well, Islam is neither capitalism nor is it Marxism or socialism, but it's something in between the two, right? And there are a lot of Muslims, right, who today you would think that, okay, well, because of their perspective about economics and the opinions they adopt, that Islam itself is fundamentally socialist or Marxist in its sort of its fundamental teachings, right? Of course, there are aspects of Islamic economic teachings, which one would, when they see them, they would think, okay, well, yeah, this looks like some of what we call socialism, especially when we think about the issue of social responsibility, because Muslims believe and Islam is taught is that the rich take care of the poor, those who are strong take care of the weak, so those who are needy should be taken care of by those who are not needy. Right? But socialism takes it a little bit further than that. And we'll come back and we'll talk about this, and I imagine questions are going to come up in the Q&A, and of course, I welcome, of course, my teachers to offer any sort of insights as well and corrections from that. But in this particular book, but in this particular book by Ali Salman, he mentions that most of the Muslims who have written about economics, they focus on two areas. One area is with regard to property ownership, and then second of all is property or asset circulation or redistribution. But none of them focus on wealth creation. Right? So he tried to introduce the element about creating wealth. What did the Prophet ﷺ advise us about how to create wealth and acquire wealth? Right? So that is an aspect which hopefully we'll deal with it as well. Now, often when I ask students, usually in my first class, because like at Zaytuna, I've been teaching Islamic, we call commercial law, like al-Buyur, Islamiyya, for more than a decade now at Zaytuna College, and also teach Islamic inheritance law. So I've been delving in a number of the areas of, where Islam covers matters related to wealth. And then recently I taught economics for the first time as well, right? But one of the very first questions I often ask students is, what does it mean to be wealthy? Right? What does it mean to be wealthy? Right? And so I'm going to ask you the same question. What does it mean to be wealthy? Any takers? What does it mean to be wealthy? Who's wealthy?
One who has more than he needs.
One who has more than he needs. Okay, that's one good answer, right?
Whoever gives the dollars has indeed been given abundance as well.
Alhamdulillah. Yeah. As you would expect these type of answers from people who are rooted in Iman, right? But a lot of our community, unfortunately, kind of come from a bit of a secular background. So they will give us secular answers as opposed to what we call the religious and moral answers. So what type of answer do you expect that someone might say, they might give? Say, well, what does it mean to be wealthy? People don't automatically, a lot of people don't automatically jump to, well, okay, to have Iman, right? To have a good family, you understand, they will think about something else. Yes.
I would say good health.
Good health. Okay, there's another one, good health. Yes, Dr. Khalid. Enough, all those sort of contentment as well as wealth, right? So these are all Islamic teachings, right? They're very crucial, foundational Islamic teachings, right? But the most common answer that I receive from students is to be wealthy means to have a lot of money. It means to have a lot of money, right? Like dollars, for example. And I also try to disabuse them of this understanding, or this what I consider a misunderstanding. Now, naturally, all the other answers that were given, I totally agree with them. But if we are focusing in the realm of ownership of assets, you're talking about asset ownership, right? That most people don't generally think or answer that, it's about health, or it's about family, it's about Iman, but they'll say, okay, it's to have a lot of money. Right? It's like be a millionaire, be a billionaire, right? And people often think that, okay, to be wealthy is to actually own things, which is really what it means to be wealthy, right? What it means to be rich is actually own the items that you can purchase with money. The money itself is not the wealth. The money is a medium of exchange, is a way for you to acquire the things that you really want. You really want food, you want clothing, you want a house, you understand? So you want a car, that's wealth. Land, that's wealth. And our educational system has programmed us in such a way that the average person sees or believes that one of the most monumental things that you can do in your life is to go to an Ivy League school, get a good job, high-paying job, right? In other words, to be an employee of someone else, right? Now, but I don't think billionaires think like that, right? But it's perhaps the billionaire class that is part of, or at least members of that class, that has actually programmed us from a long time ago to accept the idea that to be an employee of someone, right, to be at someone else's mercy, right, with respect to your provisions, is actually the best thing that you could do, right? Yeah, there's not a whole lot of talk about entrepreneurship, right, for example, or investment, for example. Most students who go to university, they don't learn those types of things, or go to high school, don't learn those types of things. I remember I was having this conversation with Sheikh Hamza one time, and I said to him, well, a lot of people are mad at the white man for slavery. And I said, I'm not mad at the white man for that. I'm mad at the white man because he didn't teach me about money. Right. And what I meant by that is, and again, it's not all white people, right? Because not all white people are rich. As a matter of fact, there's a minority, right? Who are, but that was my sort of, I guess you would say, breakthrough that I had later in my life, is that, well, you know what? If I started off much earlier understanding what wealth really was, and I was trying to acquire those things, and I also was trying to reach a point where I didn't have to work for someone, right? And of course, everyone can't work for him or herself, right? But again, you understand what I'm saying, is that there's a type of indoctrination that kind of goes with this. So wealth, or to be wealthy, means to own wealth, right? It's to own wealth. And my bottle of water is his wealth, right? My socks, my shoes, that's what real wealth is. And so an individual, for example, may own 10 acres of land, and then someone comes up and says, hey, well, I'll give you $2 million for those 10 acres of land. And then you sell it, and they say, I'm rich. No, you're not rich. Now you're poor. The other person's rich. the person you sold your land to is the one who's rich. You're the poor person now, because if the government crashes, that cash loses all of its value. And I often give the example of Iraq, for example, like when Saddam Hussein, when his Iraq fell, if you remember, like we see these videos of people raiding the banks and they're rushing out with these notes, right? Thinking they're rich, but not understanding that fiat, what we call fiat currency, only has as much value as the government that backs it, right? But when there's no government, those notes or those pieces of paper have no value at all, right? So you can take your $2 million today, but then there's a stock market crash or a crash of the currency tomorrow, and then that person you sold your land to actually is wealthy. They can do something with the land. They can rent out the land. They can grow crops there. They can sell crops to other people, right? You understand? So the different things you can do with that. At any rate, moving along, one of the first questions that come up in the study of property ownership is the question of how you become an owner, or how do you acquire, right, property. In the books of fiqh, they have a chapter called hiyaza, some methods call it hose or wad' al-yad, right? Well, basically they talk about, okay, how do you become an owner of an asset, right? So theft, we know, is haram. You can't, if you steal something, that's not halal wealth for you. If you cheat someone, right, that wealth is haram wealth. But there are fundamental ways that you actually become a property owner. So either you're going to buy it, you barter, you exchange it for something that you have yourself, right? It can be cash, or it could be something other than that. And maybe you somebody gives it to you as a gift, right? It's a transfer of wealth, of ownership, from the other person to you. It can be through inheritance, for example. There are different ways they become an owner of wealth. And if you actually make claim of some type of item, they make a distinction between what we call aqad and manqul, sort of the typically what we call real estate or movable or immovable. Items. That's right. Movable or immovable properties. Right. So if the item itself is ownerless, then the fundamental rule is that once you pick it up and you take it in hand, then it takes about a year before it becomes officially yours. Right? As long as someone's making claim and they can prove that actually it was theirs before you took it, it's yours. But then if you actually make claim of something which is owned by someone else, it all depends on the type of property it is and how long it takes for you to become an owner. All right, so for example, if it's a movable item, like for instance, you can easily transfer a bottle of water, is it your bottle of water or not, or a pen. Typically they'll say, well, as long as no one's making a claim that it belongs to them for a period of 10 months to a year, then it's yours, right? But if it's immovable property like land or a home, up to 10 years. And there's actually even a hadith, even though there's some weakness in it, that claims that the Prophet ﷺ said, Man haza shay'in ashra sinin fahuwa lahu. That whoever owns something, or acquires something for 10 years, it belongs to him. If acquires something for 10 years, it belongs to him. And with respect to like land, he also said, Man ahya ardan maytatan fi lahu. In the beginning of the hadith said, Al-ardu ardullah wa ibadu ibadullah. He said, all land belongs to God. All land is God's land, and all people are God's people. So whoever gives life to a dead land, it belongs to him. And whoever does work on a land or cultivates a land which does not belong to anyone else, then the person, you are more deserving of that particular property. Now, in terms of the protocols, like as I said, there are about 11 I wanted to focus on. The first one is offer a good or a service in exchange for the item or asset you desire. That's the first protocol. In other words, that Muslims should not be expecting to be given handouts. Right? And there's actually a hadith, and I think that quite often people don't reflect deeply on what actually it means. And this is a hadith of keep God and He'll keep you. And if you keep Allah, you find Him before you. And so whenever you ask, and ask Allah. Whenever you ask Allah. Now, this can mean when you supplicate God. If you want to ask someone for anything, you ask it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Well, it means that completely, right? But we often think about this, okay, Allah help me to heal, or Allah protect my child, etc., things like that. But it also it suggests that when an individual is seeking something that he or she needs, that let Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be the first one that you actually direct your petition to. Why? Because Allah is ultimately, He's Ar-Razzaq, right? He is the provider. Allah is the provider, right? And there's a hadith of Abu Dhar where he says that the Prophet ﷺ, he ordered me to do 7 things, and among the things he ordered him to do, he said, Amarni alla as'ala ahadan shay'a, right? That Amarni alla as'ala ahadan shay'a. He ordered me not to ask anyone for anything. He ordered me not to ask anyone for anything. And so you can actually translate this as he ordered me not to beg for anything from anyone. Right. So the first protocol is to offer something in exchange for what you want. Right. So if you have a skill, you have some type of service that you can provide, then you offer it to the person in exchange. If you have cash or you have some asset that you can exchange for that thing, then you offer that to that individual in exchange. And there are multiple examples of this from the Quran and the Sunnah, right, that reinforce this idea. For example, there's a famous story of Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, where on the Fath of Mecca, he became very ill. He thought he was going to die. And the Prophet ﷺ visited him. And when he visited him, Sa'ad was asking the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, should I or can I give away all of my wealth? He said, I have one daughter, that's it, who would inherit my wealth from me. And he decided, I want to give away everything that I own. Right? He's on his deathbed. He want to will everything to him. And the Prophet ﷺ said, no, don't will it all. And then he said, well, what about half of it? And the Prophet said, no. And he said, well, what about 2/3? He said, no. He said, what about 1/3? He says, الثلث والثلث كثير. He said, yes, 1/3 is fine, but even that's a lot. Then he went on and he told him, it is better for you to leave your family well-to-do, أغنياء, right? أن تدع ذريتك أغنياء خير لك من أن تدعهم فقراء يتكففون الناس, right? أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. It is better for you to leave them well off, right, than to leave them poor, standing with their hands out to the people, begging. They may or may not give to them. So there are multiple examples like this from the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. And so this is one thing we need to understand. And this is really important because if we want to talk about, for example, the idea of socialism where we take from the rich, we give to the poor, or we take from the rich and we give to everyone else, right? Because that's really what it boils down to. Because one answer earlier when I asked, okay, what is wealth? What does it mean to be wealthy? Was to have, more than what you need, right? Which is a legitimate answer too. And most people who are actually asking to be given from what the billionaires and sometimes even what the millionaires own. Bernie Sanders used to say he rarely gives the billionaires and the millionaires a long time ago, but then he changed once he became a millionaire. And now he already talks about the billionaires, right? We need to do something about the billionaires, right? He's a millionaire himself, so with a few different houses. So these billionaires, they have too much money. Right? Or Mamdani would say, I don't believe anyone should be a billionaire or should have the right to be a billionaire, for example. They said, well, who are you to say who has the right but doesn't have the right to have that much wealth? And again, and it's not to say that billionaires or many billionaires are not guilty of great immorality, right? Many of them are very much, responsible for that. But this idea that we just simply demonize someone simply because they belong to a particular category of person in society, that in itself is un-Islamic. Right? But there's a difference between trying to convince or even extract wealth from people who have a little bit more than what they need and to share it with people who don't have enough. That's one thing. But the socialist mindset is one that it suggests that or insists that even though I already have a whole lot more than what I need, we need to take the money from that individual and divide it among the rest of us. That you already have a home, you already have 2 or 3 cars, you already have, a computer, you have a telephone, you have your cupboards are full, your refrigerator is full of food, right? You're not, starving, you're not struggling at all, but you're just upset that you can't be as rich as someone else. And we know the problem with hasad, of envy. So this is a fundamental problem. So we should be willing to, if we actually want more than what we have, is that, well, listen, what can I offer? We should feel that this is what honorable people do, that the Muslims are people of nobility and honor. So I should not be willing to accept to be on government assistance forever. If I fall into difficulty, okay, if government provides for some assistance, we should have the attitude that until I get on my feet, right? And once I'm on my 2 feet, then leave it for someone else, someone who really needs it. Right? But there are people we know in our families, that who it's transgenerational, that they think, okay, well, I'm on welfare, my kids are gonna be on welfare, their kids are likely gonna be on welfare as well. So anytime there's a threat to welfare benefits, it's like, oh my God, they want to, make life difficult for us. But because the belief that they're entitled to a consistent stream of money and other type of goods to be given to them by the government. And that's not to say that certain people in society should not be accommodated. Like I think if it's the case of women overall, right? If a woman doesn't have anyone there in her family to take care of her, yeah, sure. If a government take care of them. But again, that is a point of debate. But the first protocol, once again, offer a good or service in exchange for whatever you seek. The second protocol is do not overextend yourselves, nor those you hire. Don't overextend yourself. In other words, right? Burden yourself with work that you can bear. Because the person who truly cut off from their journey is the one who actually doesn't traverse any land, nor does he leave any mount alive. In other words, you're using a camel, you're a horse, and you overwork your horse. You're a camel. We've seen this recently in New York. Horse collapses, and there was an accident where a buggy crashed, and a young boy, 18-year-old, he was killed. Right, but sometimes it's the horse, sometimes it's something else, but sometimes we can overwork ourselves. So the Prophet ﷺ, both in the area of devotion and in matters of material interaction. Right? So do not overextend yourselves, nor those you hire. Number 3, spend on yourself, then on your dependents. Ibda bi nafsika, thumma biman ta'ulu. Start with yourselves, treat yourselves well, and then those who are your dependents. Feed yourself, then feed your dependents. Each one of us, when we ride on an airplane, they tell you that if you lose cabin pressure, and then your oxygen mask, it falls down, make sure that you adjust yours before you help anyone else. Because You can't help anybody if yourself you're struggling. If you're struggling to find, you know, the ability to breathe yourself, then you can't help anyone else, right? But if you are a provider, then the direction the Prophet ﷺ, he gave us was to start with yourself, take care of yourself, then feed yourself and feed those who are your dependents. So that's number 3. Spend on yourself, then on your dependents. Number 4, spend from the surplus and live within your means. So spend from when you reserve from the fadl of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you. So fadl and afu, we find these terms utilized in the Quran. ماذا ينفقون قل عفو. So if they ask you, what should they spend, say al afu. In other words, the surplus. Spend from the surplus. Now, certain Sahaba we know had special maqam, special station, like Abu Bakr and Umar. Like Abu Bakr, when the Prophet he asked the Sahaba to give towards the campaign, what does Abu Bakr do? Abu Bakr comes up, actually, start with Omar. So Omar, the story starts with him, is that, as we know, he said, when the Prophet asked us to give on that particular day, I felt that it'll be the first time I'm ever going to outdo Abu Bakr. Right? So Omar comes and he gives away half of all of his wealth. But then later Abu Bakr comes and Abu Bakr gives away everything that he owns. And then the Prophet asks him, he said, well, what have you left from your family? He says, I left him Allah and his messenger. I left him Allah and his messenger. And the Prophet accepted that from them. Right? So they had a different spiritual state than the average person. But the average person, you give from the surplus. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't give from the surplus either. Right? But generally, if you want to talk about good wealth management, you don't spend from what you don't have, that you give from what you have. And of course, in those moments when the community has needs, you dig deep and you try, to make that extra sacrifice. Make that extra sacrifice for the sake of preserving the well-being of the community. So number 4, the 4th protocol, or what I call the protocol, is to spend from what is extra or surplus and live within your means. And this is one of also the problems of our times, our civilization, is that everyone is trying to live the way that everyone else is trying to live. And our system has made it possible for us to do so because we have a credit system. Right? So again, we talked earlier about the question of the currency itself and the nature of the currency that we utilize and we spend, but then we also have access to credit. And what's interesting is that in the Quran, the very last verse that was revealed was, according to many of the scholars, is 285, which is, which says, وَاتَّقُوا يَوْمًا تُرْجَعُونَ فِيهِ إِلَى اللَّهِ ثُمَّ تُوَفَّى كُلُّ نَفْسٍ مَا كَسَبَتْ وَهُمْ لَا يُظْلَمُونَ. And take guard against a day wherein you shall all return to Allah, and every soul will be recompensed for what it has earned, and they will not be wronged. Right? So what a fitting way to end the revelation of the Quran. Now that verse comes on the tail end of verses related to riba, right? And the verse that actually declares war upon anyone who works and deals with riba. Right? But we often overlook too that the following verse, 286, is called Ayat Dain, the debt verse. And it's the longest verse in the Quran. And it's the very fact that it's long kind of, it makes you feel like Allah wanted us to feel the burden of debts, right? By making it the longest verse in the Quran. Because we'll rail against the system and we'll say, well, riba is the problem. But we don't talk about the fact that debt is also a problem, right? Because you can't have riba without debt, first and foremost, right? So people become over-leveraged. So many of us are over-leveraged in debt. And it creates a state of sort of like a neo-slavery, right? And the process, long-term debt. Your house is long-term debt. Your car is long-term debt. You might even have computers, long-term debt. Your phone may be long-term debt, right? And that one moment when you lose your job or some national or international crisis happens, and then, right, they come and say, hey, If you don't do this, you understand, everything's gone, right? You're fired, right? You have to do, so in other words, it places you in a state of slavery. Debt itself, debt slavery was one of a very common type of slavery, and people forget that. And we say that slavery is over. Well, yeah, physical bondage is over, right? The slave trade is over, perhaps with the exception of sex slavery, right? Sex slavery is still very common. And I remember years ago I learned that Berkeley and San Francisco are actually two the capitals of sex slavery, which is really interesting, right? Some of the most progressive parts of the country or the world, have much more more sex slaves moving in and out of those cities, right, than any other part of the world. But people became slaves through warfare. You lost the battle, you can be made a slave. If you subsistence, if you were starving and you found someone who was growing crops, and you would go and you ask the person, hey, well, I'll work your land if you give me part of the yield, right? Or it was through debt. You borrow something from them, and then you don't have the amount needed to pay back the debt when the deadline comes, and you say, well, let me work it off, right? So indentured servitude, et cetera, things like that. So debt slavery, I think that we live in a state of neo-debt slavery, right? Because of the regular access to credit. And so with people, you see people online who, especially, unfortunately, a lot of Black neighborhoods where the prom, right? People spend heavily on the prom, and it's like conspicuous consumption. This term is utilized to express this idea that they consume because they want to show off what they have, right? People spend thousands upon thousands of dollars on the prom, as if the same amount of money that people may be spending on a wedding. Right? It's almost like the closest thing we get to a wedding is like the prom, right? But it's like, well, everybody else is doing it, let's do it ourselves. So debt itself is a big problem. We need to think deeper about it. And so living within one's means, and it becomes a difficult challenge to do that naturally, because if you're living in somewhere and everyone around you seems to have everything that you ever would want, right? It becomes a challenge to do that. So what people do is they go into debt, right? But you have to understand the risks that come along with that. So that was 4, spend from your surplus and live within your means. The 5th one is spend on those in need. Spend on those in need. So before we talked about the importance of spending on yourself and then on your dependents, but this is a different one. It's about spend on those in need, right? So there are 2 different types of need that we learn from Sharia. One's called darura and one's called haja. So darura is something without which life would no longer be possible, right? And a haji or haja is something that removes hardship, for example. Right? So 2 are legitimate types of need. If we find a person who doesn't have his or her sustenance for a day, that we have a communal obligation. It's a communal obligation for us to make sure that people are fed, to make sure that people are taken care of, right? As a community, right? That's like an obligation. I think that we should keep that in mind, because we have to pay zakat. Zakat is compulsory on people who have the means to pay zakat. And then look at Allah's mercy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He imposed zakat only on certain types of wealth, right? Farm produce, which of course here you have your dry fruits, you have your grains, then there's on gold and silver, and then we say the substitutes for that today, like in cash, and then there are livestock. 3 different types of livestock. Of course, they were actually 4, but they're cows. The book at bovines, there was sheep and goat, and then camels. Right? But with respect to cash, and most of us, we only have cash, right? So we pay zakat in cash. Zakat is not due on your income. 2.5% is not of your income. It's 2.5% of your savings, right? But with the condition that those savings reach a certain level, amount, and then they stay at that amount for an entire year. Now, once you reach that amount, to that threshold, we call it nisab, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't make it an obligation upon you to no longer spend any of that money that you have. You actually can spend what you have. But the condition is that if after a year, if you have the nisab, let's say for example in gold, like right now it's probably like, I don't know, I think it's maybe close to 12,000, right? Right, for the nisab for gold, something like $10,000, $12,000 for gold. If you have that amount in savings, for example, if you're using the gold standard, if you use silver, is a lot lower, right? But I use silver typically because I don't have that kind of money. Because it's like with the gold standard, it's going to be a lot. You pay 2.5% of that after a year goes by. But if you decide during that year to spend that money, you don't have to pay zakat anymore. So zakat itself is already something we know is an obligation upon those who qualify. But here there's a step, something a little bit further. This is basically saying that, well, there's something else beyond zakat that you have to pay. And there actually is a hadith that says, "Inna fil mali lahaqqan siwa zakat." There is a right due on wealth other than zakat. But there's also a hadith that says the opposite of that. Laysa fil mali haqqun siwa zakat. There's something is debated among the scholars of hadith in the area of ittirab. Right, but it's like, well, but this one hadith basically says that there's an obligation, other than zakat. وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِأَمْوَالِهِمْ حَقٌّ وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ فِي أَمْوَالِهِمْ حَقٌّ مَعْلُومٌ لِلسَّائِلِ وَالْمَحْرُومِ. So the Quran says those who have a designated right or portion that is assigned to the sa'il wal mahrum, to the beggar, the one who asks, and the one who is prevented from asking, the mahrum, the one actually is too shy to ask. So there's this understanding that we do have a social responsibility towards those who actually have fundamental needs. If they don't have enough to survive, we have to provide it as a community. If they don't have enough to remove hardship on their lives, as a community, we have an obligation to provide for them. And I think that these are the aspects of our religion and prophetic teachings, which somewhat confuse a lot of Muslims who are inclining towards what we call socialism or Marxism, because it seems that they deduce because Islam promotes social responsibility, or often they call it takaful al-ijtima'i, that socialism is more akin or more in line with Islam than capitalism. In capitalism, right? So they say, yeah, of course, let's take the money of the rich people and give it to these poor people. Not my money, but their money. Because I'm not rich. And I'm not rich, why? Because I'm not a billionaire. Only billionaires are rich. But again, we have to change that understanding too. Is that to be rich doesn't mean that you're a millionaire. Right? That if you have, like I said, if you have a 3-bedroom home, for example, 2-bedroom home, you have a car, you have food, you have clothing, and you have some spending money, right? It's like, you're living, right? You're actually well-to-do, you're rich, right? If you have surplus, you have savings, you are rich, right? And the trick that's been played on a lot of people is this idea that you're not rich until you have $1 million or more, right? But that's not the fundamental teachings of the religion. So spend on those who are in need, like parents sometimes. Sometimes your parents, they can't take care of themselves. Right? And then other members of your family, like for example, like the Hanafis say that if even beyond your parents, because most methods say that as a child, you're required to take care of your parents if they're poor. You're required to take care of them. The Hanafis take it a step further and say, no, this applies to any family member. If you have any family member who doesn't have their basic needs, you have an obligation as a family member to help them, provide them with their needs. And then, of course, it goes beyond family to the community, etc. Number 6, the 6th protocol, avoid debt and credit. Of course, we talked about this already. There's actually a hadith where the Prophet, he said, وَالَّذِي نَفْسِي بِيَدِهِ, by he in whose hand is my soul, if a person were to fight and die in the way of Allah, لو كان أحد لو أن رجلا قتل في سبيل الله ثم أحيا ثم قتل ثم أحيا ثم قتل ثم أحيا ثم قتل لم يدخل الجنة وما دخل الجنة حتى يقضي عنه دينه حتى يقضى دينه. That if a man were to be killed in the way of Allah and then brought back to life, and then killed in the way of Allah, and then brought back to life, and then killed in the way of Allah, he would not enter Jannah until his debt is paid off. Until his debt is paid. So debt itself is really severe. It's a really serious issue. Right? And I think the Muslims have made an error to only focus on riba. They say, well, riba is a problem. Well, riba is a problem because of the foundation, which is debt. Now, debt itself, a credit is something permissible. You can actually loan people, a qard hasan, right? That you can loan things to people. People can incur debt. As a matter of fact, one of the most famous Sahaba who incurred a lot of debt was Mu'adh bin Jabal, radiallahu anhu. You know, this is actually one about whom the Prophet ﷺ said, وَعَلَمُهُمْ بِالْحَلَالِ وَحَرَامِ Mu'adh bin Jabal. Said the most knowledgeable of the halal and haram is Mu'adh bin Jabal. So he was a scholar, right? So Mu'adh bin Jabal was a scholar, but he became over-leveraged with debt. And one day all of his creditors, they showed up because the debts were due. He wasn't paying it off. They showed up at his house. He refused to come out, and the Prophet heard them screaming. He said, well, what's going on? What's happening? And then he said, Mu'adh, he owes us this and that, and he won't come out of the house. And so the Prophet, he forces Mu'adh to come out. And what does he do? The Prophet, he liquidates all of his wealth. He liquidated everything that Mu'adh owned. The Prophet, he liquidated it and gave it to the people who was owed something, but it didn't fulfill all of his debts. Right, but he told those people that this is all you get right now. Right, but when Mu'adh was being sent to Yemen, we know that story. When the Prophet sent Mu'adh to Yemen to go teach the people of Yemen, that he said to him that it will be okay to accept gifts from people. Now, as a member of a government, as Mu'adh was at the time, typically a government official was not allowed to take gifts from people. It's usually interpreted as a type of bribe, right? You know, so the Prophet ﷺ allowed for Mu'adh to do so, to accept gifts from people, because he didn't fear that it was going to compromise his deen. And he said that maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will utilize whatever you earn to cover your debts. Now, the Prophet ﷺ passed away within that first year of Mu'adh's his sojourn in Yemen. So he returns to Medina about 2 years later during the reign of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. And Mu'adh is rich this time. Now he's rich. So Mu'adh was poor. He didn't have enough. He was borrowing money from people. And the Prophet had to liquidate all of his wealth, all of his belongings. And then to defray the remaining debts, he allowed for him to accept gifts from people. And then use that to pay off the debts that were owed. So he returns during Abu Bakr's reign, and he has slaves, he has a lot of things. So Umar ibn Khattab was sitting with him, and as he was sitting, there were these people coming to Mu'adh, and they were handing him things and walking back and forth. And Umar was like, "Well, what's going on here? What's happening?" He said, "Who are these people?" So Mu'adh told him, "These are my servants, these are my slaves." And so Umar said, "Did you ask Abu Bakr, could you have them?" So Mu'adh says, "Why do I need to ask Abu Bakr for permission for what I already own? This is my property. Why do I need his permission?" So that night, Mu'adh said he had a dream, and in that dream he was over a brink. He was at a ledge, and he was about to fall into the ledge, and there was like a pit of fire below it. And so as he was falling, all of a sudden he felt like a tug on his waistband. And so someone who had caught him before he fell into the fire. And he turned around and looked and saw it was Umar ibn Khattab. This is in his dream. That very night, Umar tells him this. The very next day, Mu'adh, he leads the prayer. His slaves, they're following behind him. And when he finishes, he turns to them. He says, who did you just pray to? And they said, we pray to Allah. And it says, "Intaliqu fa'antum lah." Said that go, you're free to go. You belong to him. So he set them all free at that moment. So you can see like anyone can become over leveraged in debt. A loan is halal, right? But we don't want to take too many loans because this is what can happen. So avoid debt and credit as much as possible, right? Limit it, or perhaps we can, sort of refine that to say something. Limit your limit the number of the amount of debt that you incur. Number 7 is avoid riba, because we already know if we already talking about debt now, riba, we talk about usury, or I loan you $100, I say you have to pay me $150. Everyone agrees that that's a riba, right? So that is a bit self-explanatory. I don't think I need to go into any deep explanation for that. Protocol number 8, avoid unnecessary risk. This is what we call al-gharar. Al-gharar is like the sale of something, or bay ma'doom, bay majhul, the sale of something that doesn't exist, the sale of something that cannot be described or identified. For example, you go to Atlantic Ocean and we say there's a well there, and some guy claims he owns the well and say, hey, well, I'll sell you that well for $1 million. Right? Well, how are you going to sell me the well, right? It's like, well, how do you catch it, right? How you catch it without harming it? Or you see an eagle flying in the sky, I'll sell you that eagle, right? How do you want to get the eagle to come down? You might have to harm the eagle, right? So then you're even if it does belong to the individual claim that it is his, you may have to harm the actual animal in order to get it to come down. So then the item or the asset now has a defect, right? But stipulation often would be that, well, if you can get it, it's yours. So avoid unnecessary risk. This is where we get the prohibition of like playing the lottery, gambling, and things like that from as well. Avoid unnecessary risks. Some risks are necessary, but there's some level of risk which is tolerable. Let's say, for example, you buy a coat. You remember down coats? Remember those down coats? We used to sell them. Of course, naturally, they have a lot of feathers inside of them. It's unreasonable for you to say, well, I want to see the feathers. Open it up. I want to see what kind of feathers are inside it, right? Or if you sell a house to someone and someone stipulates, well, I want to see the foundation. You can't see the foundation, right? So in other words, there's some things some level of risk that I have to take, I'm required to take. Number 9, leave your family wealthy, not poor. And we already talked about this in the story of Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas. Right? So leave your family wealthy if you can, rather than poor. Right? So in other words, become somewhat of a protocol or suggestion. So the Prophet, he chose poverty. So some people have a misunderstanding. They think that the Prophet was just poor. He was just poor, right? Because he couldn't find any sustenance and things like that. No, he chose poverty, right? And this is why when his wives, when they came complaining about not having enough, he made an offer to them. In kuntunna turidna Allah wa rasulahu wa dar al-akhirah. Ya nisa an-nabi, how's it go? Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Ya nisa an-nabi. Anyway, it's not coming to me right now, but from Ahzab, the ayah from Ahzab, that they made an offer to them that, if you want the dunya وزينتها فتعالين ومتعكن وأسرحكن سراحا جميلا, right? If you want this dunya and all of its embellishments, then you can come and I will set you free and give you a beautiful severance. Beautiful severance. Why? Because to be the wife or from the Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, you had to be willing to accept a status where you would be deprived of the things that other women, right, were not deprived of. And that's the thing that's interesting about Islamic culture, or at least when we talk about the issue of the nobles, at least the Ahl al-Bayt and the Azwaj al-Nabi, alayhi salatu wasalam, is that a woman is sharifa, she's noble, but made her noble was that, well, not so much what made her noble, but what identified her nobility was her lack of freedom. That's one thing. In other words, that they were restricted in their movement. They couldn't. So women who actually had more freedom to go about and do whatever they wanted to, and they could choose to marry whoever they wanted to marry. They can choose whoever they wanted to as their wali for marriage. They were not considered to be noble women. They were ignoble, right? Historically, so it's like, because when people have more access to you, you're less valuable. Your value decreases, But when people have more, so when they have more value, more access to you, then your value decreases. The less value they have access to you, then the higher your value is, right? And so you would think that if these women or the wives of the Prophet, they are noble women, then they would have silk garments, and they would have gold rings and necklaces and anklets and bracelets, but it was the opposite. So the Prophet, he actually chose poverty, and his wives were required to be patient with his selections, his decisions, and because at any moment he could have asked the Sahaba, he could say, listen, give me this, give me that. He would have been the richest man in Arabia in a moment's notice, right? But he chose poverty. But he told Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, he told him, it's better to leave your family rich than to leave them poor, standing with their hands out, asking people who may or may not give to them. So that was his counsel to others. Protocol number 10, do not acquire wealth by illegal means. We know of the hadith of ثم ضر الرجل يطيل السفر أشعث أكبر يمد يديه إلى السماء يا رب يا رب ومطعمه حرام ومشربه حرام وملبسه حرام وغذي بالحرام فأنى يستجاب له. Is that that the Prophet in this hadith, he made mention of a man who is on a long journey, he's disheveled, covered in dust. He raises his hands to the sky, oh Lord, our Lord. But his source of food is haram, his source of drink is haram, his source of clothing and attire is haram. He's been haram, he's been nourished by haram. So how can his prayer be answered, right? So we should not acquire wealth through illegal means. And again, when you're trying to steal money from the billionaires and the millionaires, that's fundamentally what you're doing, right? Because unless the billionaires and millionaires took your money, now of course you have the right to take it back. But if they did not take, or rather they became wealthy because they offered someone a service or a product that people found to be attractive, and they paid for their product and they became rich as a result of it, that they did that through legal means, and it will become illegal for you to act like Robin Hood, right? And say, I'm going to go and take. As a matter of fact, I'm not going to take from the rich and give to the poor. I'm going to take from the rich and give to myself. So it's a step even further. And then number 11 is that grass, water, and fire are commons, or are the commons. So in other words, there are certain types of things on earth that no one individual is allowed to own exclusively, right? And deny everyone access to it. And there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that says, "Al-Muslimuna shuraka'u fi thalath." وفي رواية الناس شركاء في ثلاث. that the Muslims are partners in three things. In one narration said the people, all people are partners in three things. In water, in pasture, and in fire. Now, there's a contemporary interpretation of the part about fire and say that fire is an analogy for fuel. So this is why you find in certain Gulf countries, they actually give their citizens dividends from the sale of their oil proceeds, right? And there's the based on this hadith. This hadith, the Prophet says that the people, they're all they're share owners, right? They're partners, right, in these three things. So in water, pasture, and fire. So in pasture, meaning that if you have animals, livestock, and you have a surplus, right? You can, there's a kind of an elaborate sort of discussion about it in the books of fiqh, about the limits of this understanding with regard to pasture, but nobody can say, well, this is all mine, and only my animals can graze here. If the other individual has no access for his or her own animals, then generally they're allowed to graze in those pastures as well. So the idea of the commons, right? So again, another one of those areas of Islam where a lot of Muslims have a misunderstanding about whether or not Islam is more inclined towards what would be called capitalist ideas as opposed to socialist ideas. And I don't like even calling Islamic economics either capitalist or socialist. It's just prophetic teachings, right, regarding, or prophetic economic teachings. And just one few more points and then we'll open up the floor. So Islam pursues moderation. There's a pursuit of moderation, in Islam with regard to the moral life, with regard to the management of wealth. When an individual is a spendthrift, then that itself is a sign of lower or deficient intelligence, right? Based upon the fact that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or rather Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, it refers to the spendthrifts as sufaha. Do not give to the spendthrifts or to the fools your wealth, meaning their wealth, that Allah has made the source of subsistence for them. In other words, talking about the orphans and people like that. So it pursues moderation. That the Prophet ﷺ encourages us, and the Quran encourages us to feed the poor, but also discourages us from begging. So there's a balance. Right? So on one hand, we should feed the poor, the needy, but people should not beg. Or rather, if you want something, if you need something, then you should offer something in exchange for whatever you want. Be it a good or be an asset. Be a good or a service that you offer, or utility. The Quran tells us not to devour, consume, or practice the payment and charging of riba, but it also tells us not to become over-leveraged with debt. Because if you're not borrowing money from anyone, then you don't really have to worry about falling into riba. Right? So there's a balance there. So both are important for us to consider. Riba is bad, but also too much debt is bad. Right? And another aspect of balance is that the Prophet ﷺ, he was opposed to price regulation, setting the prices of things. For example, there's a story about how on one particular occasion, around some type of famine happened in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and Sahaba came to him complaining that the prices of the goods have increased, they've become exorbitant. And so they asked the Prophet, to set the price or regulate the prices for us. And the Prophet responded to them that in Allah huwa al-musa'ir. Allah, He is the price setter. He is the one who sets prices. So sometimes writers in economics, they'll say, well, this is the evidence of the Prophet promoting what Adam Smith called the invisible hand, right? is the idea, okay, well, Allah sets the price, meaning that people, when they meet together, that they themselves will come to a fair price between one another. There's a hadith where the Prophet forbids a city dweller from selling on behalf of an outsider, right? Do not let one who is an insider or a resident, do not allow a resident to sell on behalf of an outsider. Leave the people alone. Allah will provide for some of them from others. Right? Leave the people alone. Let them come to their own terms. Right? You may, someone comes to the town and they see that you're from one of those rich countries, you're from America, you're from Europe, right? This happens in the Muslim world all the time. Where the Moroccan price, for example, of say a bag might be 100 dirhams. Then all of a sudden they see you come and say, "Oh man, it's gonna be 1,000 today," right? And you may say, "Okay, well, good price. That's great. It's only $100 because you like 10 to 1, maybe. If that's the ratio, the rate between the currency. So you it's like $100. Oh, this really nice bag, $100. But this is suggesting that in that type of situation, potentially that would be halal for that person to charge a different price, because as long as the other individual was willing to pay it. And this is probably not the best example, because I actually don't think that that's halal in that particular situation. But in general, depending on the type of market, there are different types of markets. We didn't talk about that either. That's something else we can talk about, the different types of markets, because an auction market is opposed to a haggle market, as opposed to a set price market, right? To where you go to the supermarket, you're not going to get to the register and say, "Hey, well, I know it says $10 here. Can you give it to me for $5?" They're going to smack you. What do you mean, right? So the price is what it is, right? But in certain other places you go, you can negotiate, you can talk people down. You say, "Well, this is $500 too much. I'll give you $300." You can talk people down, and that's a different type of market. And in an auction, everyone knows and understands that I'm coming here to bid on a particular item, but I know someone may outbid me. Right? So it all depends on the market. Certain things are halal in certain markets, which are not halal in other markets. But the Prophet ﷺ, or in Islam, or rather the Prophet, he was opposed to setting prices and regulating the prices of things. But at the same time, he forbade people from hoarding needed goods. Right? Because often when people, like, for instance, let's say I'm selling wheat, right? I'm selling eggs, I'm selling meat. But like milk, for example, cheese, which are staples, right? People generally see them as necessities. If I'm holding on to those things until they become scarce in the market, so that once high demand, when the demand increases, that now I want to get the highest price possible for them, then it's haram for you to do that, for you to hold food or those type of things that are the necessities. You can't do that. But if it's another type of thing which is not a necessity, it's okay for you to hold on it for a while and wait for the price or the value of the thing to increase. But the balance is that on one hand, while we don't accept the idea that prices should be regulated by the government, on the other hand, merchants should not have the right to actually hoard things that are necessities for people. So we have that balance from the teachings of the Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam. And so this is what I call my 11 economic protocols of the Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam. And I'm quite sure that I've missed some things, but hopefully it gives you a good start on things, and looking forward to the Q&A, inshallah. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum. Yes.
Did you write a book on the subject?
I've written an introduction to a book on Islamic economics. I think before you came in, I had mentioned it by an author, a Pakistani economist by the name of Ali Subman. They have a book that's called Islamic Economics, Markets, Morality, and Justice. So I have a foreword that I wrote to that particular book, but I haven't written something specific about this yet, right? But I do have a book on Islamic or the what is considered the ethical commerce, Islam's view of what is ethical commerce. I started writing some years ago. I still plan to finish it one day, hopefully. And it's a book which I guess you would say is much more of a primer into Islamic economic philosophy, I guess you could say. Because when I first started writing it, one of the things that prompted me to write it was that when I looked in the bookstores and the available books for Muslims, it's easy to find something on zakat or insurance or riba, Islamic finance now, right? But it's hard to find a book that actually starts you from the very basics. In other words, like, okay, acquisition, wealth acquisition, contract, the rules of contract. What are the elements of a contract? What are the conditions for each element of a contract, et cetera, things like that, and then different chapters beyond that. So make dua and pray that, that maybe by next year I can finish it and make it available. Of course, I'll have my teachers look through it as well. Yes, sir.
Do you consider oil, crude oil is one of the comments when you last?
Yeah, crude oil. Yeah, this is, again, that's an interpretation that is accepted in multiple of the, we call the GCC countries. And so that's why they actually do give their citizens, not all the Muslim citizens, like dividends from the sale of the oil. Right? So it's hard to become a citizen in some of the countries like UAE, for example, or Kuwait. So a lot of the citizens are well off because of that. Those things sell. Well, I've been selling for a long time. So yeah, if it's if we can analogize it with fire, which is mentioned in the hadith, and this is what it seems that they have done, then yes, it would be an example of the comments. Yes, that's exciting. Yes. Right.
That's what I understood. You own something to see if anyone else challenges that ownership. So
Right.
suppose you own something for 9 years,
Mhm.
invested in it, you made it better, and then 9 years rather than 10 years, someone else comes and says, "Oh, I didn't hear about this, and it was my grandfather's land.
Mhm.
I want it back." So what happens to
Right.
the investment that the person made on the property, who had it for those 9 years, believing that they didn't believe that they were doing something wrong?
Right. Yeah. So like the question is related to what I mentioned about the 10-year minimum, which it needs to pass if someone claims ownership of something which was formerly owned by someone. So that you would have to wait 10 years as owner or claimant of the property before it legally becomes yours, right? So the question becomes again, what if you put in a lot of work? You've done enhancements, you've improved the property itself, and then the original owner appears, right, in year number 9. So now, okay, what happens to all of the money that you put into this? That there's definitely a claim that you can make in this particular case. And this is truly what happens is that if you actually are holding someone's property and then you enhance it in some particular way, that you do have a right to the yield or any enhancements that you made on the property, unless by removing those things, it actually want to harm the actual property. They say, for example, it's crops there. Right. Let's say, imagine that it hurts the soil to actually take those things out. For example, I don't know if this is exactly what happens. I'm not a farmer, right? But I'm saying, for example, let's say something like that occurs, then it wouldn't be permissible for you to remove those enhancements in that particular situation. But you can get compensation for it. You can be compensated. You would have to be compensated for what you put into that particular property during that particular period. So you wouldn't lose, right? According to Sharia, everything that you put into that particular property over those 9 years. Yes.
On the issue of credit and debt and REBA, say if you have a credit card and you have an option to say it's a 0% interest option, and you possess it as long as you circumvent have to pay extra.
Right. So the question is about credit cards and the 0% interest rate on the credit cards, whether or not you can keep the credit card as long as you are able to make the payments and avoid being charged a late fee. Right. Now, the late fee in a credit card is a riba. I know riba. Right? It is, that's in essence what riba is. It's sort of like a late fee, right? So any late fee, regardless of whatever amount, is riba. So, but really, this takes us back to another question, which is whether or not the fuqaha consider it to be permissible to actually own a credit card. Now, I think most Muslims living in America probably own credit cards. So it's kind of like an afterthought, right? Now, but there are madhabs who have the view, for example, the majority of the madhabs, if you apply their principles, right, then it would not be permissible to actually own a credit card, any credit card that actually says that we would have to pay a late fee if you were late, right? Well, obvious, if you're late fee, it's redundant, right? Yeah. So, because they say that any particular contract with a haram stipulation makes the contract void, right? But the Hanafi position is that the shart itself, which is haram, right, doesn't invalidate the contract, but rather the condition itself is made invalid. Okay? So in other words, you may agree to it, but as long as the essentials, the integrals of the contract are intact, right? Which of course is, we're talking about, of course, the two parties of the contract. We're talking about the offer and acceptance. We're talking about there's the point of contraction, et cetera, things like that. So as long as everything is intact, and there's simply a condition that's added to it, that the Hanafi principles are that particular opt or a contract is fasid, not batil. So they make a distinction between those two terms. Fasid is when something is, ما كان مباحا بأصله ومحرما بوصفه, that it is permissible, by its origin, but it is made impermissible because of a particular characteristic. So this characteristic would not invalidate the contract. The other three schools would say, well, the whole contract is invalid from the point you agree to it, because you can't agree to pay a riba. So, but again, in some ways, it's kind of like a moot point, because I think the average Muslim, you understand, finds some justification. We all become Hanafis, right?
If you travel and they don't take cash,
Yeah, things are changing, right? So it's almost like zakat al-fitr, right? So how many Muslims actually give staples for zakat al-fitr? Do you give rice and dates, and you give cottage cheese, or you give whatever? What you give in, because that's what the three schools, the Shafis, Malikis, and the Hanbalis stipulate is what you have to give for zakat al-fitr, right? But the Hanafis are the ones that say you can give an ayn or a currency in exchange for it. You did the qima of it. Is the Hanafis who say that. So we're all Hanafis when it comes to zakat al-fitr, and I think we're all Hanafis when it comes to credit cards as well. And then some people may be able to avoid it, and I think that if you are able to avoid it, alhamdulillah, that's good, because having a credit card is, again, just placing you in a situation where you're going to incur debts, right? Especially if they continue to increase your credit, the amount, of credit available to you, because like you pay it off and they go, oh, here's another 10,000, here another 10,000. It's like, wow, right? And you say, well, I'm going to take advantage of that. You say, I'll just pay it back, but then you do it and it's almost never pay it back. It just keeps getting higher and higher and higher, right? Because you have some other bills over here and over here, So the average person becomes irresponsible, and I think the people who design the system, they know that. They know the average person is not going to be very responsible, so that's why they're willing to just give it out to so many people. Yes, I forgot, brothers. I'm sorry, SubhanAllah.
Yes, sorry.
All right, sit down. Brother Kel, I'm sorry, what's your name again?
Rafiq.
Rafiq, I'm sorry, Rafiq. I'm sorry, it's been a long time, right, Rafiq. You too.
That's an interesting comment that you just made regarding the school of thought.
Yeah.
I had not heard that before.
Mhm.
If we were to apply that, if that was applied to institutional building, because I think that is one of the things that prohibits us or limited us to developing our own institutions, whether it be a hospital, gravesite, on and on and on and on, clinic, and so forth. Because we don't want to borrow the money to build the institution and then pay it back over a particular term.
Mhm.
So what I'm hearing, what you're saying, that if the borrowing of the money and a contract was signed, that this is how we're going to pay this off, then that could be considered a letter.
Right, yeah, well, if my understanding of the Hanafi school is correct, then yes, right, then it would be halal. But I do, for me, I just caution us, against like just going deep into debt, right? Because, that's something I think it often gets missed. Because it would be nice to have this thing, right? This building or whatever, this recreational center, whatever it may be, nice to have it. But remember too, we have to maintain it as well, right? And in the process of having to maintain it, we are trying to pay back whatever loan that we took out, and then there are other expenses that we have to consider as well. So you understand. So with caution, but yeah. So halal, but Islam is not only about halal haram. It's also about what is I can show you what's in our best interest and what's detrimental as well, right? So we want to avoid harms as well, potential harms, because the more long-term debt we have and the larger that is, and especially if it doesn't match our income. Because like say, for example, you buy an $8 million house and you only get paid $100,000 a year. You understand? It's like, well, you're going to lose your house eventually. You're guaranteed, unless you get some big break, right? Some stock that blows up. Right? It's like, yeah, maybe, but you put yourself at risk.
Well, the reason why I bring it up because our community is suffering.
Yes.
For lack of various different things for us to be self-sufficient. And this becomes one of the impediments that continue to come up.
Right.
Say, well, we can't do this because of that, but we can support everybody else, groups and so forth.
Yeah.
And surely you do the projections and the budgeting and all that to make sure that it's feasible for you to do. But so my question is, how do you see us arriving at a point that we begin to build institutions for our community to improve the quality of life for the Muslims?
Yeah, that's kind of a big question. You might not like my answer, right? But well, it starts with the understanding that the community needs whatever the project is that we're planning to start, but then it also requires a number of committed people really, really committed to that particular project. And I think that part of the commitment entails sacrifice, personal sacrifice as well, right? And that may even that may be something like downsizing, like, your own personal home, right? You understand? Whatever. I mean, it's actually a conversation we can have. I don't want to go into too detail with these about my thoughts on it, right? But yeah, that's definitely a way, the normal way that people do it is say, hey, we'll just take out a big loan and let's do this. But we always want to make sure that we have, again, a group of people who are really committed to this and they trust one another, that they're not going to let this particular project get sort of like just fall apart, right? And so not just, that part is key, just having the right people together, who are, we want to try just to make it work. But like I said, the other stuff, like I don't want to go too deep into my thoughts on it. And I'm not saying I'm right about the way I think about this, but I'm just saying that I'm just trying to caution us against like just taking on too much without ensuring that the people around us are also like totally in, right? Because one person, I know you've been trying to do projects like this for years, right? Yeah. But it's like, and you've worked and you've done some very good projects as well. But I do think that our community is, we've been suffering for a number of decades because I think that we just have a lot of distrust among one another, and again, I just say that this is out there. Yeah. Yes, sir. Michael, what's up, brother?
Let me ask you this on behalf of the institution.
Yeah.
That mold. I remember years ago, I'm at 19 to show that. Used to be a pharmacy right there. Me and a guy walks in. He said, real smart guy.
Mm-hmm.
One of the only guys that made it out of there. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
He said, not feast. What you call it, blue back then. He said, this $10 Snickers bar, right, is going to be $1. He said the year. And I bust out laughing. I said, come on, man, you kidding me? He said, I'm telling you. He said, the based on the projection is that. Anyway, make a long story short. I want to know if the institution that loans you the money, if they have a projection of the lessening of value of the dollar in a particular time or point of time. Are they justified in charging you that amount because of that projection in the lessening of the value of the dollar in like 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years?
As the owner of an asset, you have the right to charge whatever you want, right, for your asset. In other words, your phone, right? If you want to sell me your phone, you might ask me for $5,000. So you, this for $5,000. If I'm willing to pay $5,000, it's sold, right? The fact that they're basing their, the long-term price on some particular formula does not have any type of bearing on the permissibility of them being able to sell their asset for whatever price they're willing to put on that asset, as long as they can find a buyer. So I know a lot of times people think, well, just because this is kind of like, is what's the term we use for it? It is earmarked, or what's that? No, not so much kickbacks, but basically, like for example, they all say that based on some particular interest rates, right? Right, amortization schedule, things like that. That in 10 years, 15 years is going to be worth this much. You buy a house with 100,000, but actually you end up paying 200,000 for it because of the again, it's the markup itself, right, over a certain number of years. So what needs to be understood as a Muslim is that when you buy something, that you have clarity on what the final price is at the time that you sign the contract, right? But if at the time you sign the contract, the price is going to fluctuate, or at least put it like this, that you believe that $100,000 is the price of the item, right? But then it turns out it's $200,000 over 15 years, then you probably shouldn't have signed that contract because you didn't have clarity on the price. Because one of the conditions for the price is that it has to be defined. It's ma'lum, right? So you can't have a fluctuating interest rate. Like for example, subprime loans when they were out there, you're paying. Back to those years, it's like, I'm paying $700 a month for my mortgage, and then next year it's gonna become $2,000, right? Next year it's gonna become $2,000, right? Because it's subprime, because it's not a set APR or anything like that, fixed interest rate. But if you have a fixed interest rate, fixed interest rate makes it permissible, right? But then the question just fundamentally becomes, or rather the area of debate just becomes whether or not this is a loan or a purchase, right? Right. So this is, for example, Islamic finance countries, their biggest selling point is that, oh, well, the difference between us and conventional financing is that, when you actually buy your home through conventional way, is that you're trading money, less money for more money. But with us, you're trading money for an asset, which itself is a cop out. Itself is like very deceptive, right? Type of language, because if this is not if you loan me $1,000 and tell me to give you back 1,200, no one disagrees that that's a riba for you to do so, right? But if you sell me if you bought your house for 1,000 and you sell it to me for 1,200, that's not riba, right? That's just the markup, right? You understand? So those in the Islamic finance sector have to explain, okay, well, when I purchase a house in conventional market, if this particular purchase is nothing more than money for money, then why do I end up with an asset? How do I end up with a house if it's just money for money? Because it doesn't make sense, because my reality tells me something different. You said it was just money for money. Then I should only have money, but not a house. I should only have money and not a car. Right? So I think what it is happening, they found like a demographic, a willing demographic who is very concerned about the Islamicity of like those type of contracts. And this has become like a way that they sell it to them to say, well, hey, we're different. But they really functionally are not different, right? Because again, they're still using that same schedule like conventional bank would do, and they say, well, same price or even sometimes more. You're paying a sort of Islamic finance company, but there's no one-to-one correspondence between classical riba and the sale of like conventional houses. I mean, the current way that people sell houses and cars and things like that, the financing that happens in it. So, but they function in pretty much the same way, right? And they end pretty much in the same way. Their pricing is pretty much the same, right?
So are they justified in making that projection?
Yeah, but they're justified in making the projection because, again, even if they can sell it to you for that price without telling you on what basis the price is. If say, okay, the principal cost is $100,000, right? But they say, well, in addition to everything else, property tax and the interest, whatever, maybe they don't even mention all those things. They'll just say, well, $300,000 for this house, right? And they don't even tell you itemize anything, principal, and sort of the property tax or the interest along with it, right? So they have every right to just sell you at whatever price that they're willing to accept, right, from you. Now, if you're fine with that price, it's halal, right? So the fact that they base it on that, it really has no bearing on the Islamicity of it.
And sort of in that line of thinking that you're doing that, what you're just saying. I said, I have these cameras, dealing cameras. When every year with my business, the cameras go through what they call depreciation as an asset. So, and it's based on what's called like a click count. So if I use this camera a certain amount of times, it has a certain click count. And if, let's say, just for the sake of the argument, I know next year I'm going to have 10,000 click counts on this. And the value of this camera is basically going to be very depreciated and things like this. I know that, look, if I sell you this camera and I say I bought it for $3,000, but I'm going to sell it to you for $3,500, and I know with the click count on it that more than likely this camera is only going to last you maybe another couple of months. For example. should I, as the seller, I'm the seller, I'm worried about my soul.
Yeah, right.
So now, should I be the one that inform you, look, you might want to pay such and such and such for this camera. You might really want this camera because you see it takes nice pictures and you look at my pictures and all that, but it's really not for me to sell it to you at this particular price. Or should I take advantage of your enthusiasm? You say, oh wow, you don't really know, but oh wow, I'll give you 5,000 for that camera. Should I just say, hey, bro, man, you got
Well,
it.
this is called el ghish, right? So it's item fraud, right? So there's a story about the Prophet one day he was in the marketplace and he was inspecting the items of each of the merchants, and one particular merchant had a bag full of wheat, and so at the bottom there was some of the wheat that was dampened from the rain, and so he covered it with dry wheat on top. He sold them as bags. So the Prophet put his hand inside of the bag and he went down and found it wet. He said, well, what happened here? He said, Ya Rasulullah, it's the rain, it rained, Ya Rasulullah. Then the Prophet said, well, shouldn't you put the wet wheat on top and leave the dry on the bottom? And then he said, well, Man ghashana falaysa minna. Whoever deceives us is not one of ours, right? So that's when this statement was made. So this particular case is one where you yourself are familiar with the issues, but the buyer may not be aware of the potential defects that come along with that. So that would be problematic. And as a matter of fact, there's another hadith the Prophet said that the two parties of a transaction, they have an option as long as they don't part company. But if they are honest and they clarify, meaning clarify defects, then their transaction will be blessed. But if they conceal and they lie, then the blessing of their transaction will be obliterated. So those are the prophetic teachings. So you have an obligation, if you know that something has a defect or has a potential defect, and the other person is unaware of that, then you clarify. Now, if after clarifying it, the person says, hey, no problem, I'll give you 3,500. Go right ahead. But you have to clarify what the defects are going to be in the item. Yes. Is that Omar? Sound like
Nice. All right, question. Concerning the Hajj and the Umrah, then I'm going to get back to the credit card.
Okay.
Say like if you decide to try, I'm going to try to make it next year.
Sure.
You try to go over individually by the package. Like as far as booking hotels and whatever else is needed. The credit card permission will be used.
Which means like to sort of like reserve,
Yeah.
to reserve like rooms and things like that.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, again, if accepting that credit cards are halal, right? If you say they're halal, you take that opinion. Then if you're talking about using it to reserve the rooms, then sure,
Or
right?
any other way to do it without a credit card?
Yeah, if there's no other way to do it, then buy that. But I think there's probably no other way to do it, right? Maybe it's a debit card. The debit card is probably, if they allow for that, then use the debit card. That's better and safer, right, than to use a credit card. But paying for your entire trip with credit, it's a valid Hajj to do so, but it's better not to do so, because if you're in debt, if you can't afford the Hajj, right, you don't have to make the Hajj. Like, so if you have to use a credit card to pay for your Hajj, then that means that you're exempt from the Hajj. No need to worry about it. So once you have the means, then you'll make the Hajj. But if you don't have the means, you don't go into debt so that you can make the Hajj. And what's really interesting in the Muslim world is that you find a lot of Muslims actually go into debt to get the animal to slaughter, right? On like Eid Adha, they'll like go to the bank and borrow money so they can buy their the sheep, so they can slaughter it. But again, it's kind of a cultural thing. Like people feel the pressure of culture and they do it. But for this particular question, like if you feel the need to use a credit card, then you're probably not obligated to perform the Hajj at that point. So, but if it just basically you are reserving a room, and that's the only way you can do so, then by all means. But if they allow for a debit card, that's actually the better thing to do. Use a debit card. Yeah. Yes,
In theory,
Mhm.
this example, Chicago, Detroit, New York, LA, and the likes. The poor, the blue class, the white working class, they all have a shura.
Mhm.
They ask the Muslims, we believe in your Maqasid.
Mhm.
Your Maqasid makes sense. Right? And from your Maqasid, we see we're lacking in 3 out of the 5.
Mhm.
We're struggling. Can you help us?
Yeah.
And in theory,
Mhm.
the Muslim regional scholars, the activists, they put together an idea on the ground to help you finance, education, animal husbandry, your relationship.
Mhm.
And they took a sense of this and was like, yeah, we should do this in America. This will make it better, right? Do you think that now with the presentation of what we have on the ground is finance options will need to change or look different? Because you have to have credit. You have to have access to finance. As if I were to say the example of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, when he said, these 3 things, he provided equipment, training, land, capital. You have to have.
Well,
these things at one time.
Yeah, I don't agree that you need credit for those things. I mean, as mentioned before, one of the protocols was to live within your means, right? You understand, do what you're capable of doing, right? And we don't go into debt so that we can, buy luxury items.
Right.
You understand? Because this is what it sounds like to me. It's like I'm buying animals, I'm, the other things that you mentioned, this is like beyond, like, we call darura and haja, right? It's in the area we call a tahsin or takmil. So I don't think that you need to do so, but I do think that it is desirable for our community to be less dependent upon the government, and just less dependent on
Right?
outsiders. Definitely the banks, right? And a lot of the things that are changing right now. Anyway, the banking system, the currency, all these things are changing right now. So they're going through like revolution right now. So, and most people are just only aware of like things that are happening like in the banking, the monetary system. Even some of the things that happen in international politics are related to like a lot of things happening in those particular realms, the economic realms. Some people believe, and of course, Dr. Khalid could share a lot of examples of this, like that most wars in all of them like have some economic reason for it, right? So, and I think that, like personally, a lot of the America's wars had a lot to do with the desire to maintain dollar supremacy, right? And so, because you create a particular asset that is depreciating year after year, especially the more of them you print, right? Because supply and demand, the more dollars that are in circulation, the less buying power they have, right? You keep printing more and more and more because you have a consumer-based economy, right? So up to about close to 80% of like our gross domestic product is based upon just people going out and buying things over and over and over. Right, so the government gives you more money because they know the more money you have, the more you want to buy, you want to spend. Right? You give them more money, give them more money. But the more they print of money, the weaker the buying power of the dollar becomes. So over time, it's like, well, we have to get more assets. The government said we need more assets beyond, even like oil. Right? You get some raw rare earth minerals. We have different things that actually to back up the currency itself, that they can say to the big boys, as we say, is like, hey, well, you don't need to divest in America, because at any given moment, that we have so many assets that so many assets that would, that we can cover, right? Whatever, whatever whatever debts that we have, so our assets are equal to our debts, the amount of debt that we have, with the value of our assets are equivalent to that. It's a bit of a complex issue, but I do think that generally that Muslims should be trying our best. It's like, I think most people should be trying to become more independent and less reliant on the government for our basic needs, and get free of debt, right? We should work to get free of debt, right? Because it makes us really vulnerable, right? And we saw what happened during COVID. I think a lot of people, the reason why people felt compelled to get vaccinated was because they were going to lose their jobs. You lose my job, I lose my house, I lose my car, I'm not going to be able to provide, pay for my child's tuition at school, not going to be able to travel here, travel there. You understand? So when people have that level of leverage on you, right, then they can force you to do things. But if you don't have, that amount of debt and you're less reliant, then you don't have to worry about it. Because some people actually fell for, if you want to come eat these French fries, if you remember the mayor of New York, de Blasio is like, he's on TV saying, if you want to come to this restaurant and eat some of these nice French fries, come get vaccinated, right? So you say, well, who cares? Who cares about wanting to eat those French fries? There's a man who asked, who came to Ibrahim ibn Adham, one of the early successors. He said that he's complaining about the price of meat. It was, it's expensive. So he said, "Arkhisuhu bitark." They were cheapen it by not buying it. He said, don't buy it. He said, make it cheap. You make the meat cheap. How do you make the meat cheap? Just don't buy it. Although, when you don't have feel you have the need for something, then people can control you, right? But when people feel, I need to go to the party. I need to have this ice cream or this cake. I need to be able to eat in this restaurant. I need to be able to go to the club, go to the game, right? Then they can't force you to do things that they want you to do. So I think that's the essence of freedom, right? So it's not only, of course, we have freedom, mental freedom, we have, spiritual freedom, but, we also want to have the ability to say no to people. Say, no, I'm not going to allow you to force me to compromise on things that I find to be important, especially with my body, because we all get one body, right? So people asking you to put foreign objects in your body and you don't know, what they're going to do to you. At any rate, I don't want to go too far into a different direction, but well, maybe a couple more questions. Yeah.
I want to ask you, from the time of the prophet, all the way through, Umayyad, the Abbasids, the Seljuks, all of them, even in West Africa, the Malian Empire, and some that, so Sokoto and what do you call those people?
Yeah.
How much influence do they have? Or should I ask you this? Are they rich? A lot of them that have influence over things in the community.
Yeah, well, the one way you can just translate it is that the elders, right? The community elders. Right?
But I mean, from the time of the prophets to
Yeah.
the time to those all these times, how many well-off people? This is what I'm asking: are poor people in those positions to make a policy?
If they're qualified to make policy, sure. Why not? Yeah. So, I mean, we know that many of the 10 elders from the prophet's time, the Ashara and Bashara with Jannah, they all, well, not all of them, but many of them, they were wealthy, right? They were wealthy at the beginning. Abu Bakr, Uthman, Abdurrahman, Auf. I mean, they were wealthy people, and so they supported the prophet's cause, right? So, when the prophet passed away, Islam, he left them in charge, and they were the ones who appointed for Abu Bakr to become Khalifa, and we know the story, right? But the Ahli wal Abd, they're just basically you can say the elders, right? The people who were the chieftains, right, of any particular society, the representatives of the people, right? So generation after generation. And so that's fundamentally how they operate. So, and if they're not rich, they have access to riches. You know, they can request them, right? They can have riches, but that doesn't mean that, or didn't preclude a poor person from taking part in the decision making process. Imam Ali bin Abi Talib wasn't very rich at all, so he was one of the elders as well. So, yeah, yes, just another. I could sit down a second.
Welcome home.
Yeah, thank you.
I wanted to ask, can you tell me what you feel would be the best way to establish a independent banking system within the constructs of your own family?
It's in your own family, right? Yeah, Brother Abdullah around, is there other support? They've been trying to see start a bank for like how many? A couple of decades, right? 2 or 3 decades. Well, bank in your own family. I mean, this again, it starts with surplus. You know, you have some surplus, and you pull it together. You give it to someone who everyone trusts to secure it, and you have rules for borrowing it as well. Maybe like only a certain percentage can be borrowed, at a time, and it has to be repaid at a certain time, right? And we also make sure that people actually have an income to ensure that they actually qualify to actually repay it. I mean, this basic, the basic way that I guess you can say that in some ways our credit system almost already works that way, except that a lot of people who actually can't afford certain types of purchases are given credit when they probably shouldn't be given it, and that causes its own degree of instability in the system, and perhaps it's intentional as well, because when people lose the ability to pay for these things, they're repossessed, right? So they repossess them, and then they resell them at a particular price. So, yes, Mr. Said.
I won't belabor it, but President Peace brought up about people older in the community who have a rapidly aging community that basically has not taken care of their financial or physical or other things.
Yes.
A lot of them. And their children are now taking care of them. One child is usually left to be the one to do that. When you talk about leaving your family your wealth and trying to be equitable in how you leave the wealth, we also marry other people that maybe our children didn't come from. And to leave your children the money, rather than leaving the person taking care of you the money to take care of you. At some point, the next time you come to talk, I'd like to hear you talk about that, because people are very confused about who they leave their wealth to and what they're expected to do with their wealth to make their end of life not a burden and a debt for someone else to carry it out.
Yeah.
That happened to me. That's why I'm talking about it. And I'm older, I'm 72. So I'm looking at a time in my life that who will take care of me may not be my children.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's an extremely important topic. There's actually a hadith where it's a weak hadith, but it basically it says that the Prophet said that the first knowledge that will be taken from the world is the knowledge of inheritance law, right? So, older ilm yufqad, right? It says the first knowledge to be lost, right? And when you consider how much debt people are in, you can kind of see, like, well, if you're familiar with the World Economic Forum, as a man knows, Klaus Schwab, I know that the Khalid knows about it. That some years ago they had an ad advertisement which said, "In the future, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy." Right? So yeah, you own nothing, you'll be happy, and I think it's already happening. I think we laugh at it, but I do think that it's actually already occurring when you consider, let's say, for example, for those who actually put a lot of who consider these things important, like music and movies. For example, we used to have CDs and DVD, and you can still get those sometimes. A CD for music, there's DVD, what's it, the Blu-rays and things like that for like movies. People becoming less and less dependent on those things, and they're sort of like purchasing music, and it's on Spotify or it's on Amazon, Prime and things like that. So you already have a situation where the things that you supposedly own actually are stored in the clouds, right? And it's controlled by someone else. The vast majority of cash, or rather, only about 6 to 8% of the money in circulation is cash. So most cash or transactions are already digital, right? So people are talking about like a day coming where they're going to abolish cash, right? So again, it's going to be in total control of someone else, right? It'll be in their control. So yeah, so if we're over leveraged with debts, then when we pass away, we die, all we're going to be doing is passing debt on to our children. That's if our children assume the responsibility of paying it off, right? But if we own wealth, not debt, right? I mean, like, reducing the amount of long-term debt, or if we do have long-term debt, trying to pay it off as soon as possible so that we don't have to worry about it being passed on to, like, the government, for example, the government taking it as opposed to sending it to one's children, then we'll be in a better situation. Then so I lost my. I said so maybe two more questions. Let's see, Brother Hassan just got here. Sorry.
So as far as wealth, I was thinking about when you asked the question about wealth and material wealth and being assets, but I feel like there's another layer that it's also your ability to protect your assets from being
Right.
taken.
Yeah.
And part of the discontent, I guess, with billionaires, also billionaires and billion isn't what it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
Billionaires is that there are so many ways to hide your wealth so that you don't have to contribute in the same way. Like income is treated one way, and then depending on what the company is or where it put things in a trust. So there's just so many ways that the assets are viewed differently. And so it's like all of these loopholes that, like, yes, take advantage of them and try to secure your own wealth from being taken from you, but also that it's a way that can make an uneven playing field for people. And so a part of the discontent is that we'll then find a way to tax all types of assets more evenly, I guess.
Yeah.
And then I also had a question, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
And that's as far as like, if you lent somebody, I want to know if this was different than whatever, that if you lent some money and you didn't charge an interest fee, rate, but you said, I'm gonna lend you 100, I'll give you 6 months to pay it back, but at the end of it, I'm gonna give you like a lending fee where you're paying 150. So
It's a riba.
that's still considered.
Yeah, no doubts. Bless you. Yeah, I know riba. Right. Yeah. So the other question is a really important one about like issues of taxation. Was Benjamin Franklin? The two things guaranteed in life is death and taxes. Now, apparently, it doesn't apply to everyone, right? But I think it's important for Muslims to come to terms with, and I think that people in general to come to terms with what I would say is a fact, which is governments do not have a right to your property. Right? Because we become so accustomed to paying taxes and being indoctrinated into the idea that taxes are inevitable. What comes along with it is the idea that government has a right to what we own. What you own is what you own. The government doesn't have a right to what you own. Now, the question of like whether or not you're going to evade taxes, I'm not telling you to evade taxes at all, right? I'm not telling you that at all, because listen, it's been live streamed and recorded. I'm not telling anybody, I didn't say anybody that they don't have to pay taxes, but you understand, if you choose not to, there are consequences. And the primary reason we do pay taxes is because we don't want the trouble. That's it. It's not because the government has the right to my property or a portion of my property. And that applies to the poor, the middle class, and the rich. So if the rich people find a way to, find a loophole around that, right? It's like, well, and it's a legal loophole, then you understand? I mean, they're not really doing anything immoral, but they're just trying to protect their property from the government, right? And we should be able to do the same to protect our property from the government. Now, as Muslims, we know that we have an obligation to pay zakat, but we already talked about that. Okay, well, when there's multiple conditions that have to exist before zakat is compulsory, right? And so once I reach nisab, it say, okay, I have $12,000 in my bank. I can't touch it. No, you can touch it. And then it goes below nisab, and then you don't have to pay zakat anymore. Right? And when it goes up again, okay, and the year goes by, now I have to pay zakat when the year comes, right? If I still have anything above it. So, but I do. That's an important thing. I think that we need to consider, an important thought. And I do think that is a fact, and it was a concern of the founding fathers: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Pursuit of happiness, and a lot of right to private property. They're concerned with the government taking their property. The founding fathers. I mean, one of the reasons they wanted a republic as opposed to a democracy, of course, Dr. Khalid can correct me here, it was because they didn't want the majority to be able to take their wealth from them. So because if you make it, because the word democracy is nowhere in the Constitution, right? We live in a constitutional republic, right? So it's representative government, and if it becomes a democracy, then people are going to vote to take other people's money, take their property away from them. I mean, it's a concern of ancient Greeks. Right? So, I mean, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, they didn't have very positive opinions about democracy either. So it's there's a lot to consider here, But I say about one final. You want to say something, Dr. Khan? Yes, Dr. Khan, you want to correct me? That's the place to. Yeah.
That was an excellent presentation.
Alhamdulillah.
I've learned a lot. Thank you all. Thank you all the people for commenting too. And of course, it's a really big thing, so it's impossible to talk about it briefly, especially for someone like me who never said but it is complicated. Now, this issue about the government, for example, you are quite right that a lot of people would think that if only we could grab control of the government, then everything would be fine. That would be the position of people who are the so-called progressive socialists and so on. It's if we could grab control of the government, now it's in the hands of the evil. But if we could take it over, then everything would be fine. And that probably isn't the way things are going or the way things to look at things. What you want is for people to have real property. And so the people, if everyone can have real property and hold on to what we have, yes, that is a great virtue too, because what is coming along is really, really ugly looking. I mean, frankly, it looks awful. And that is indeed stripping people of their property rights, basically, is the idea of the system, because the system itself has an economy that is not sustainable, and they therefore look for more profit opportunities. So they seek to impose tolls and rents on people, and that's how you have this whole rent idea that you don't own a computer program anymore, you rent it, and you won't own anything, and all of that. But things aren't always what they seem to be on the surface. Here we have a country that's called capitalist, a system that's called capitalist, but is it really? Or is it actually a kind of socialism? That's the kind you're denouncing, like socialism for the rich, privatization for the poor. Right. That's what it is. So if we compare it to, say, the Soviet communist system and the USSR, which all of my life for decades and decades we heard propaganda about how evil it was. Actually, the people there didn't own their houses, that is their apartments. The state owned them, but on the other hand, they did have the right to live in the apartment. So you find the same generations of people that were living in those apartments 60 or 80 years ago are still in them, and they still have control over them and so on. Once an Algerian in Seattle said, the trouble with America here is that people don't really own anything. In Algeria, where they had practically a communist country, it was very, very socialist. And that was because the ruling class were the French colonial settlers, and they all got up and left in 1962. So the people established a kind of socialist system to take over the properties that had been left by them. But there, people have a right to live in their houses. So the Algerian was saying, like, we have a right to live in our house in Algeria. They can't throw us out for failing to pay taxes or anything, like they could throw people out on the street. And I had this discussion with the libertarian professor that I was in a book club with at one time. And he had a book where he described that, human rights are very limited. So what are the human rights? He said, well, the humans have a right to air because you have to be able to breathe to live. So nobody can monopolize the air and sell it to you. And he said, humans have a right to food because you also need food for nourishment. And I said, okay, but those rights are rather few. What about space? I said, doesn't a person have a right to space? Because if they don't have a right to space, then how can they exist? And all of the libertarians said, oh no, there is no such thing as a right to space, of course, because that might compromise and harm real estate. So we have this huge problem of the homelessness all over the place, which is a very big growing problem where people have no right to space. And now the city of Philadelphia itself is driving homeless people out of their encampments and so on. So you don't have any right to space at all. It reminds me of the Beatles song Taxman, where they'd say, it's 1 for you, 19 for me. If 5% should seem too small, be thankful I don't take it all. And then they also said, if you walk too far, I'll toss your feet. Well, that's what they'd like to turn all the sidewalks into privatization, so if they could charge people to walk on them, they would, but they would never maintain them, and they would fall into ruin because the ideal of the predatory system we live under, whether it's called capitalism or not, is you give us all your stuff and we'll give you nothing in return.
Yes.
That's their idea.
Yes, right.
Walmart, if they could say to you, okay, give us your money and we're going to give you nothing, they would.
Yes.
But they can't because nobody would, do that. So they minimize everything, cut costs there, everywhere, and it's like a big race to the bottom. It's a disaster. And maybe Islam can offer something. We have to inject some ethics back in.
Yes. Yes. So, mashallah. Well said, Sheikh. That's definitely a project of mine. That's why I try to critique, right, the norms as well, and so that's why I say, well, we need to question whether or not.
It's important you have my support.
Alhamdulillah. All right, well, alhamdulillah, great. And I know that there will be some other questions, and on the way out, I'll try to answer them. But I'd like to, of course, thank Sheikh Anwar, Sheikh Anas for inviting me to speak here once again, and for all of you for coming out and of course, making me feel at home once again. And and then I'm hoping that we'll get more opportunities to do this every year. Moving forward, and hopefully our community can try to salvage something, right, for the future, and especially for our progeny. And so just thank everybody for coming out, and may Allah bless all of you and protect you. So, well, I think we'll check it.
So